Everybody, let's see who all's here. We are being recorded. Helen, I'm so delighted to have you here. And Kathy and Robin and Peter. Wow, we got a whole crowd. I'm going to probably start in about 2 minutes just to give everybody a chance. And what we'll do is I'll probably ask you to unmute yourself for a second and introduce yourself so I know who's here and kind of what your questions are or what you want me to focus on. And then I'll go through some slides for probably about 20 minutes, I hope. And feel free to interrupt or send questions. Does everybody know how to use GoToMeeting? You can add comments in the chat, so just click on that little, it's on the side of your screen. You should have a little bubble like that, and that's your chat line. So just send me that or unmute yourself and say, Katie, talk to me. It's very informal, and afterwards I will send out a recap, a recording of this, and the slides as well. And if in the process of the conversation or questions, I promise to send you something, it will be in the follow-up email. So that's kind of the routine. We'll go to give it 1 more minute, see if anybody else is going to join us. And maybe what we'll do, you know what we'll do is it'll take me a second or two to turn this off. So let's just start in a second. Turn that off. Thank you. Now, share screen. There we go. Can everybody see? Everybody see my screen? If somebody can't see my screen, can you send me a chat real quick? And actually, if you can see my screen, send me a chat real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this. Application window. Share that. So everybody should be seeing Surfing the Data Tsunami. I'm hoping. Oh, good. Okay, great. Confirmation there. So now, here's the whole idea of data in communications. And in whether it's PR or social media or anything else, this is your typical scenario, which is basically you're sitting there with questions and demands for your time and demands for your budget. And about 47% of the stuff you have to do, you just have to do. It's that, I'm just guessing, just on 30 years worth of experience. 37% is somebody thinks it's a really good idea, and chances are they have more power than you do, and you have to do it. A few things you're probably doing just because they're really cool and you want to do them. And about 5% of the things that communications does relates back to making money or achieving whatever the mission happens to be. That's not your fault. It's the fact that when people come in and make demands of you, like constantly, they want to do what they want to do. And unless you have data, you can't really push back and say, that's a really stupid idea. So the idea is that you have the data in hand, and it doesn't have to be complicated. This is a story that got me into measurement for the first time 30 some odd years ago, but it really was why I got into measurement, was the fact that I had just spent an insane year launching 6 products at a company that nobody remembers anymore called Lotus Development. And we had done parties and press events and press tours with the media and, you know, press release distribution. We'd done all of those different things. And the whole idea was for all of these different, and in this case, I just put up 4 of the products there, but these are actual data points. But the whole idea was to get the messages across because they were complicated products. They were software products at the time. They were building on Lotus 1-2-3, which was the only thing everybody knew us for. And they all had different kind of key messages and positioning statements. The whole idea was to get our messages across. So the first thing so I'm sitting in my office one day, and a product manager comes in for the next big thing, which actually turned out to be the future Lotus Notes, and said, I want to launch it just the way we did for Manuscript. It was a great party, and the shrimp were great. And I said, well, that's good, except let's look at this comparison chart, put a little bit of context. We did all of these different launches by different things. And Manuscript was the big party, and we got fewer key messages across and more negative messages across than anything else we'd done. And I said, and oh, by the way, right, if I put in the budget numbers for this and look at a cost per message communicated, since my mission was to get messages across for these products, Manuscript cost about $2.25 a message, and one source, which was that press drawer with the product manager and technical press, that was about 25 cents. So, Mr. Product Manager, what would you rather do? And he said, oh, let's do it your way. And since I'd never actually heard those words come out of the mouth of a product engineer in technology, then I decided that that was probably a good reason to start a company. So that's what I started doing. But here's the thing. Everybody has a whole bunch of different agendas when they're asking communications folks to do stuff, right? I mean, so sales says, you know, please announce our latest contract win, and marketing announces our latest strategic alliance, and CEO says, I hate talking to the media. So what do you do, right? And again, I had data. We had all of these different things that we had done over the course of a year. This was for a different technology company. And we said, okay, once again, the mission was getting messages across. Let's just look at the percentage of coverage that contained key messages. And again, this is 25 years ago. This is not sophisticated stuff at all. But when you show an executive that executive interviews get across the most messages, and those dumb contract wins and the dumb positioning statements on industry issues that it takes forever to get everybody on the same page with the damn press release, got the worst negative messages out there. So again, once you could sort of point to this data, they listened to us. And literally I had 20 engineers going, oh, well, that's right, let's do it that way. So it starts off with getting a clear definition of where communications fits in this process. And if you've heard me talk, you've probably heard this thing before a million times, but basically, let's just call media coverage, and it could be the beginning, media coverage could be the beginning, it could be the result of a tweet, it could be the result of an event. Anything can go up here in this top little bar, but basically somehow you have the start, a spark of something. And that is typically what earned media does. It is the spark that gets you to some kind of thought, action, something. The key thing is, and Helen, you've probably heard me say this before, because it's this whole idea in my head started with a meeting up in Canada with a very smart data guy who happened to be running the communications department at the time. And basically I said, what do you think PR is supposed to do in this stuff? You're begging me for metrics for social media and traditional media, but you got to tell me what you expect those things to do. And he said, oh, well, that's easy, right? That it starts the whole process. Nobody's going to come to Canada if they don't see something about us, if they don't get a recommendation or see a story or whatever. And I said, well, could it be any story? He goes, no, it's got to be a story that contains our key messages and our talking points and all the rest of that stuff. And I said, and then what? He said, well, then, then with any luck, we'll put something out there that will get an influencer to recommend us. And then there's an opportunity for engagement, or there's a call to action, or there's a link or something like that. And then ultimately you get revenue and, some sign of activity or behavior or whatever. So that's the process that you have to start with before you even start thinking about collecting data, because you've got to get agreement on what those things are. And they're going to vary by industry and market and all of those things. And and nonprofit versus for-profit, and depending upon the goals of your organization. But you got to start with that conversation. So recently I had this conversation with a very successful data-driven grocery store chain. And I asked them, what are your most relevant metrics? And they were all business metrics. It was, if you read my newsletter, this was Measurement Maven, I think, from last month or 2 months ago, at Lidl. But she had it in her hand. She had a definite advantage. It was a metrics-driven company. So she had lots of relevant business metrics like customer retention, increased revenue, increased profitability, visitors, cost to close a sale. They knew all that stuff. That's the way they were. Now, I understand that not every organization out there is like this, but the good news is because they had that data, we could tie that and correlate that to all these other things that were relevant to the brand that comes out of that came out of the communications function. So increased awareness, number of brand mentions, preference, share of coverage focusing on their brands versus everybody else's brands, share of favorable product reviews. So now you understand, those are sort of literally databases or data sources, data period, that you can now get a hold of to try to bring into your metrics program. So Procter & Gamble started out with, they want to sell stuff. They knew that it was desirable photographs, recommendations, brand benefits that made people buy. So they started tracking those things in their media coverage, and that translated through their marketing mix model system. If you could tell them how many people saw photographs, recommendations, and brand benefits, they could predict how many people were going to buy shampoo. For Helen, for Canada, intent to visit, as exhibited by either the download of a visitor's guide or asking for more information. I mean, there was an acceptable proxy for intent to visit, because you can't necessarily count everybody who, walks into Ontario or Canada or New Jersey or wherever it happens to be. But you've got to define, and in that case, it's a photo, it dispels a myth, it's a, signature experience of some sort, as a call to action. For a media company I'm working with, it's basically almost the same thing. It's a signature program mention, key message, recommendations, and some social engagement. They know, because they have ratings data, that leads to ratings, which leads to revenue. So, and I'm not going to walk through each one of these, but essentially, you've got to define those left-hand column things over there, so you know what data you need. So now, right, let's just take the B2B company. Now if that's what drives the business, you're going to need to track third-party recommendations. You're going to need to track key messages. You're going to need to track the number of spokespeople quoted, or the number of mentions of desirable positioning. Now, everybody's going to freak out and say, oh, but that's hard. I can't do that with my little, meltwater system. Well, no, you can't, right? You're going to take the media that actually drives people to your business, right? Especially if you're in the B2B business. If you're selling mass spectrometers, you do not need to be in Vanity Fair, right? There's so many major publications that do not influence your audience. And I'm working with a company right now where every decision is made by this target media list. And I said, well, what drives the target media list? Thinking that it should be, market research shows that these are the most influential media outlets on our purchasers. It's the number of frequencies, number of times they cover them. Well, there's a fundamental problem with that, because just because you get covered somewhere, if it doesn't influence a person to behave and or change his or her mind, who cares, right? So it's got to have every decision you got to make. So back to how hard is it to track those four things? If you're only tracking 25 or even 50 publications, it's a lot easier than trying to track it for the world. And so if you start to focus your efforts on those things that actually drive the business, data becomes a lot more manageable. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. We can talk about them because I want to make sure we get lots of time for questions. But if your goal, if you're, on the internal side, or actually this was for the grocery store chain, right? Lower employee turnover, growing market share, risk and cost avoidance, increased sales. Those were the business goals. Communications came into the meeting with me to say, these are our communications goals, right? We had asked them ahead of, I cheated. I asked them ahead of time what they were so we could actually get a list and match it. And so I could say, okay, this business goal, lower employee turnover, how do we translate that into a communications goal? How does communications contribute to that business goal? And so it's perceived as the employer of choice, and there's a lot of, unhappy people to brand ambassadors. Anyway, so we went through every single goal, translated it into a communications goal, came up with a benchmark, right? Because you've got to have a benchmark if you're going to put your data into context, right? 10% doesn't mean anything unless you know that you got 10% message communications and the competition got 2%. Or that last month you got 20% message communications and this month you've got none. That's a problem. You've got to have that context. And what you really should be using for context is whatever keeps your leadership up at night, right? What are they worrying about? And chances are it is the competition. And if you're in a nonprofit, it's probably what donors think, right? Or what foundations think, or perhaps with whom you are competing for share of wallet. But you've got to have some kind of understanding of what keeps senior leadership up at night, and then that's how you put it into context and have your benchmarks. So then you need your metrics, right? And everybody who's heard me speak has heard this, but basically you have to define these things, right? There's no magic bullet out there. People have been screaming and yelling for a magic bullet for PR measurement forever. And when they say to me, how do I measure the quality of my coverage? I'm like, I don't know. What does quality mean to you, right? How do I measure engagement for my employee engagement? I'm like, tell me what an engaged employee looks like. How do I measure spokespeople? I don't know. What do you want spokespeople to do? So you really have to push back on the leadership team to say, this is your decision, not mine. This is your definitions, and you have to work it out with the leadership team as to what their definitions are. Because if you sit there in your cubicle and make this stuff up, and they don't agree, it's very easy to shoot down your data. So you have to sort of start with, what it is. If they want a thought leadership program, what do they think leadership being a thought leader looks like, and what's it supposed to do for you, right? So again, it goes back to when these questions come in, make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of understanding what it is. So these are just examples. This is a quality score. This is, again, the one from a grocery store chain. For Travel Alberta, it was the signature experience and dispels a myth. Lots of controversial organizations or organizations that are sometimes in the crossfire use dispelling a myth as a definition of a good article, because when I started working with Atlantic City, New Jersey, the myth was the boardwalk had been destroyed by Sandy. So every evidence that the boardwalk was still there and Sandy hadn't destroyed the boardwalk, that got 3 points in this system. And basically what you do is you have this conversation about what's important, what constitutes a good article. You put weightings on each one. It's a weighted index. And the weighting has got to be, agreed upon with your senior leadership team. But make it all add up to 10 and minus 10, because it's just math gets easier. But these are all in here as examples, and I'm not going to actually go through all of them because I want to show you how this stuff gets used. One other thing about data, make sure you've got enough of it. Just had an interesting conversation this morning about the difference between numbers, statistical validity, and statistical significance. if you do not have enough data points, it's very hard to get statistical significance. Doesn't mean the data isn't valid. Doesn't mean that it's not good data. It's just if you're comparing two things and you don't have, you've got 180 of one and 14 of another, there's not enough data in the cohort with 14 to really use. My advice in situations like that is do what you can to combine data sets so that you do have enough data. And you got to make sure in this day and age, you've got to make sure it's accurate. It's not driven by bots or spam or, you know, Moldovan teenagers. Whatever it is, you've got to make sure that it is accurate. And that is a constant case of constant vigilance. But so as one example, right, and this is, I use this example because I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but it's a great example of how a group of people came together and really proved a very interesting point and got a whole lot of people on their side because they were able to pull data. And so we were trying to put a value on the first in the nation primary. And what we knew was we had done a media analysis of it, and I'm getting some feedback here. I hope that's okay. We'd done a media analysis of it and determined that, make sure nobody's trying to text me. So we knew that there were a ton of journalists here. We just counted up the impressions. And then we had also done a content analysis that showed that 10% of them were positive, right? So that was pure media data, pure content analysis. What the travel people knew from their data was that of every 100 positive impressions made, 3 people would visit the state. So that meant that, you know, take 3% of 22 million, you get 660,000 quote unquote potential visits. And this is based on, you know, their decades long analysis of their data, right? So that's really travel marketing came into the picture there. And then the economic development people came in and said, okay, well, we know that for every person who comes to the state, they spend 50 bucks. That's $33 million in potential revenue, which sounds good, except for the fact that then you compare that to one NASCAR race and it's, you know, about the same. And, you know, the New Hampshire primary goes on for 2 years. So then you get the econometrics guys in there, and they said, well, look at, we know that from an, you know, sort of economic planning standpoint, we know that for every 100 people that come to visit the state, 2 are likely to be corporate decision makers who are considering or might potentially move a business or expand a business in the state. I'm like, okay, fine, that's your data. And he said, you know, so then they said, okay, that's on average 132 new businesses with, you know, and the average number of businesses in New Hampshire, employees per business in New Hampshire is 20. So if we had to pay subsidies and taxes to get those people here, it's worth another $26 million. Now, I can't check their data. I got to believe that the University of New Hampshire economists are telling me the truth. But that was a sufficient number so that from that day forward, there is still, this report is still in the Manchester airport. But from that day forward, nobody in New Hampshire doubted the value of the New Hampshire primary. And it never would have happened had we not had this mix of data to play with. Another good example is just how it gets used is that when you have data, you've got, say you've got a media quality score, that's on the left-hand side, you see MQI score, that's like that index that I showed you before. And you got positive articles and you got a number of clips and you're not sure which to look at and what makes the most difference. So the first thing I did was to do a correlation between all those numbers and the number of online conversions in Google Analytics, online goal conversions in Google Analytics. Now, this is for a media company. So for them, a conversion is anybody who watches a certain percentage of a television show or donates or signs up for the newsletter. They have all these different definitions, but they've given me the Google Analytics and goal conversion data, so I can correlate all these different things in the media to all those things. And what we found was the highest correlation was with the MQI score. So great. Our definition of media quality makes the most amount of difference to what they care about. Then you can take, for example, all of their targeted efforts, right? So they spend a lot of time talking to 25 reporters that they think are important. So every month we give them a list of, here are your most important writers, and here's the quality of their coverage. And of course everybody's going to say, oh, isn't that nice that, David and John and Jim, they all did these great coverages. I said, no. Let's look down there at the bottom. What's going on with those 4 at the bottom? And what's very cool is that we've been reporting on this for them for several months now, 3 to 6 months now. And you can see, like last month, I want to say Cynthia Littleton delivered the highest quality, right? And people that were at the bottom, even lower down on this list, who weren't covering them at all, by pointing that out, now they're paying attention. Now it's turning around. So the good news is you can really move the quality of your coverage up when you have data to know where to put your efforts. This is another one for a bank I worked with where they put all kinds of other stuff out there, and they're putting, unemployment statistics out there and information about cyber tech. Who knew? But healthcare was got the highest quality and also got the most engagement. So the first thing you do is rank, get your data in line, rank everything from worst to best, right? Find out what's not working, because that's what you're going to improve on. And whatever you do, don't exaggerate data. Data is the data. Don't try to make it look better. Don't just give good news. I've had a lot of experience with senior leadership teams. They want a little bit of good news. They want to know what they need to fix it to make things better. And especially boards of directors, they really want to know what needs to be fixed, because ultimately they're the ones who are going to be responsible. And if there's bad news, don't try to hide it, because the data is the data. And if your most important audience has the worst impression of you, or is lowest on the scale of trust or reputation or whatever happens to be, yeah, that sucks. But guess what? It's worse if you ignore that news and you don't immediately change things to pay attention to them. Because if they're the most important audience and they're lowest on the trust score, they're lowest on the quality score, that's not going to help. The other thing is that you can look at, I got to put the dollars and cents in here, but the other big thing is to rank order efforts, right? In this case, these are all of the efforts that Atlantic City did in preparation for what they knew was going to be a major disaster of a summer. And this was, they had advertising going on, they had social media going on, they had staff, they were hiring agencies, they did all of this stuff. And so what they asked us to do was to say, okay, quality being dispels the myth, gets the good pictures out there, gets all the stuff out there. So I rank ordered them all, but I didn't rank order them all by best to worst. I rank ordered them all by worst to best. And surprise, surprise, Miss America, which takes the most amount of effort on everybody's part and is by far the most expensive program they did, ends up delivering the lowest quality and the fewest key messages. And it didn't entirely kill the program, but it did get them to cut back on their investment significantly. Another for events, I have a client that judges all their events by the degree to which it increases trust in the organization. And so we developed this scale, which is basically On the left to right scale is trust. On a scale of 1 to 100, basically every single attendee at every single event is given a survey and asked the extent to which they agree this organization is one I trust, I believe it has the capacity to do what it says it's going to do. A bunch of standardized trust questions that are asked at every single event. So we look at everybody's trust score, or average all the trust scores for each event. We look at the cost, which is the vertical line, and say, okay, upper left-hand corner up there, that's pretty low down on the trust scale and very high up on the cost scale. Stuff in the lower right-hand corner doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but does do a lot to increase trust. So these are all just some other examples, and I think it's now time for me to shut up and take some questions. And I can go back to any of these slides if people do have questions, but let me know what the questions are. Unmute yourself so that I can hear you if you've been muting.
So this is Helen. I was just wondering, to what extent, looking at this collection of data, did you find that senior management was actually a hindrance to effective PR?
It depends how you define senior management. What I have found is that senior leadership that is in charge of operations, finance, marketing, mostly, are almost always hugely enthusiastic. Senior leadership who have been there for a long time and are in charge of sales or communications, certain public events people. There's a lot of people who are very resistant to data. The people who produce videos, for example, right? Some of them, that's a bad generalization, but people who have a lot vested in events are very scared of event measurement other than did people have a good time at the event. When you start trying to tie events to business bottom lines, they get very nervous. People who have been around a long time and done things the same way for a long time, they get pretty nervous around data. But what I found is that people who are used to seeing data, especially, you get a lot of these MBA types who are used to data, and they're pretty receptive. I find much more pushback from sales and on the more traditional communication side of things. What about you?
I'd have to concur. I mean, those are the same sorts of pillars in my organization, and the people that are doing, I don't know, for the one of, I'm just saying, like more creative stuff that where you have to be more imaginative to make it work in the first place, are open to ways of demonstrating why they select certain ideas, because they need to prove what they do, because it's creative. And people who assume that it's going to be inherently metric and demonstrably provable don't want to know.
Interesting. Yeah, one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had was at American Public Television, I think it is. Anyways, the folks in Boston who produce public television programs, most notably, oh God, whatever the one is about cooking that I don't ever watch. But anyway, they produce a lot of well-known shows, and the people that are producing the creatives around that show were the ones who were most engaged in trying to measure their results, because what they wanted to know was, hey, I got 5 creative ideas, what's working and what's not? And I said, look at, and unfortunately the digital folks, right, the people who manage their Google Analytics, they're like, oh, well, we can tell you that. We'll just set up a goal conversion, test everything against that, and you're done. So the best marriage of data with anything is if you've got a really good digital guy who understands either Google Analytics or Omniture or whatever the heck it is that you use, and who understands that, and somebody who can communicate to that person, that data geek, what it is you want to be measuring. And what we were able to do was, by putting those two people in a room and getting the creative types to say, I need to know, can we do it? Should we do a test to see which one of these things works? And of course the digital guys goes, yeah, that's easy. It's a marriage of the different, types of folks around a table that really gets you to, leapfrog and do really cool things, even with PR, right? I mean, you've got somebody who is a classic media person who is used to being on the phone and pitching ideas to reporters and everything else. When you give them a chart that, that basically says, these are the reporters you most need to pitch, boy, yeah, here we go. Prioritizing efforts, outlets that don't include key messages, outlets with the lowest quality score. I got a list of 24 people I could call. What this says is, you need to be focusing on the Tennessean and the Times-Picayune and CNBC world and 538 and the Economist, because A, they're really influential, and B, they don't know about you, right? Or you need to really focus on Seeking Alpha and Yahoo Finance and NASDAQ, because they're not getting your messages at all. I mean, forget the people who aren't even covering you. Let's get the people that are covering you to get some of your messages out there. So that's where, if you frame it from the perspective of, look, data isn't scary. Data helps you stop doing the stupid stuff. So let's work together to find the data to let you know what you can stop doing. Because some percentage, whether it's, 10% or 70% of your program, is stupid stuff. Let's be honest about it. It's a lot of requests that, that people have of you. And, it's stupid stuff, and we did a program ages ago for, it's a private school in Hawaii that is the, fourth or fifth largest endowment of any educational institution in the country. It basically owns most of the land in Hawaii. So it's got a lot of money, but it is also governed by a charter that was set this whole thing up, and Princess Leilani basically said, you will benefit Native Hawaiians, right? All of this fortune, and literally she made a fortune. She was a princess and she left all of her fortune to the school, to set up the school. Her husband also made a fortune and gave all of his fortune to set up the boys' version of the school. So they started out with gazillions amounts of money and they just built on it. And then when, everybody has great ideas about how you can spend the money, ultimately they have to serve Native Hawaiians. So what we set up was a system where every decision was put into the context of, to what extent does it communicate key messages to Native Hawaiians? Because if you're not benefiting, helping, educating, or communicating with Native Hawaiians, it doesn't matter. And so, yeah, you could certainly have targeted programs to reach Native Hawaiians in New Hampshire, of which there are 5, perhaps. For the last 8 years, it was 1 in the White House. But for the most part, there need there needed to be a much greater focus on local stuff. And when you did that, so many of the programs, when you said that, so many of the programs that they were being asked to do essentially said, yeah, no, we've already communicated enough to all these other folks. We need to go back and focus on this. Kathy, do you have a question? I see a.
I do. With your New Hampshire example, that seems very complex. So it's based on some assumptions about the correlation between media impressions and desired activity. So saying, you know, of 100 people or 1,000 people that that read or are exposed to this impression will take this action. Is that a correlation or is that a coincidence in terms of an assumption? And would another measure other than media impressions, knowing how much you love them, have been a better measure?
Yeah, I mean, this was so far, this is way before I got into media quality scores. My experience is that in almost every case, a media quality score correlates far more highly than media impressions. But what that was based on, and don't shoot me for saying it, but basically they had spent X number of dollars and bought X number of eyeballs via their advertising for the last 10 years. So they had 10 years worth of data that they could correlate between advertising spend and actual visits. Now, the way they calculate visits is rooms and meals taxes. And it is, again, this is econometric data. This is not stuff that PR people necessarily have, but if it's, you know, for me, if it's good enough for the CEO, you know, or the CFO, it's good enough for me. They'd been using this assumption for years. And is it perfect? No. I mean, the ones that, with Paul Nursey, whatever his name was, the guy up in Canada, right? He actually had a very sophisticated marketing mix model. And he had calculated the number and cost of impressions and how many visitors that generates. You know, for most organizations, marketing mix modeling is still a little bit, you know, too expensive and too complex. But in this case, it was literally just they had 10 years worth of data. They could correlate that to the numbers that they had for tourist visits. I don't know, you know, now that I think about it, I don't know exactly how they got the number for the number of visitors. I assume that's from the State Department of Tourism as well. But anyway, it was a correlation based on 10 years worth of data. Where it gets problematic for many people on the communication side is not everybody has 10 years worth of data, right? And if you only have 3 months worth of data, you really can't do much of a correlation. You really need people will tell you need 3 years. I would argue that in these days I can probably take a year. But if you have a year's worth of Google Analytics data, almost anything you can correlate it. The thing about impression data was it was all we had, really. I mean, where they got the positive, I know where they got, okay, let me get back to this. They were assuming that all advertising impressions were positive. So we were the ones who came along and said, yeah, but the earned media was only 20% positive. So that's when we cut it down by 80% and said, okay, 20% of the total impressions was positive, so we could take it from there. But they assumed that all the advertising was positive and contained a key message, and therefore they could use that data. Yeah, I mean, in my experience, raw impressions very seldom correlate as high as quality impressions or quality coverage. And a lot of the times, all I'm doing is actually quality clips. I'm not even doing impressions. Like for CBS and a lot of the examples, we're just using the number of articles and the average quality score per week. So I'm correlating the average quality score per week to the average Google Analytics goal conversions per week. Does that make sense?
It does.
I mean, it's not as easy as just reporting on impressions, but it's a lot more impactful when you can say, and again, you have to go back to, can you guys still see a screen there? Is that still there? If I go back, so you have to go back to the definition of quality. And this is a real key point, which is the reason why quality scores correlate very highly is because they're not random scores. They're not, oh, I think it's positive, or oh, I think it's negative. It's what makes people, in this case, want to, let's go back. This is what makes people want to support this bank, right? It's an accurate story about something they did. It dispels a myth. It contains a quote. It's positive. It contains a key message. It contains a desirable visual, and it's in some important media. Now, I didn't make those things up. I got them to tell me that. I mean, actually, the grocery store example is better, right? These are the things that make people walk into a Lidl grocery store and buy stuff, right? And they know that because they've got marketing data that says, what makes people shop there. They've got experience. They've got all these other things that says, okay, these are the things that make people buy. And on the worst nightmare side, these are the things that make people not want to buy, right? Stories about food poisoning or bugs or whatever, not surprisingly. So you make them articulate what makes people buy and what makes people not buy. You pull that, make that into your quality score. So it's not that surprising that more quality stuff gets out there. The higher your quality score, the more people are likely to buy. And that's kind of the crux of the whole thing. For social, if you're trying to measure social, it's kind of the same thing. What constitutes a good engagement, right? What constitutes a good meme or whatever it is that you're trying to do out there in social media? It's got to be defined based on, does it have impact on your business or on your mission or goal or whatever it happens to be. That's what makes it work, right? That's why it's better than impressions, because it contains those things that make people want to do business with you or change their mind in the way you want, support you, change their minds, whatever it is you're trying to do. We have other questions about data or anything else. I said, any other mysteries of data? I'm trying to think about. And there's the whole, how do you get and process and analyze data is the other piece. I mean, I think that one of the bigger challenges is that if you're not an expert in Excel, data becomes a nightmare. And when people say, what tool do I need for measuring my communications or my PR or whatever, let's start with Excel and lessons in using it. Because once you have Excel, there's wonderful tools out there, IBM Watson and Tableau and business intelligence systems and all the rest of these systems out there. but unless you've got somebody who knows how to use them, they're kind of worthless. And frankly, you can do almost all of the stuff with Excel and pivot tables and, you know, the statistical functions within Excel. Other questions? Thoughts, comments, anything? Nothing? Well, we've got 10 minutes left. We can all, like, you know, go out and, I don't know where you are, but if it's nice, go out and take a walk. So next month, just to sort of give you a heads up, next month we're going to talk about the future of measurement, kind of where it's going in preparation for our summit on the future of measurement. Now, if you are interested in measurement and want to hang out and just talk about measurement and eat lobsters for 3 days, you don't have to eat lobsters for 3 days. You talk about measurement for 3 days, eat lobsters for one night, drink wine, have a good time, hang out at the farm. Our measurement summit is October 11th through 13th, and it's open up to for registration now, and just, you know, go to the Summit on the Future of Measurement on our website and sign up. And so I can tell you, speaking of data, we have the Vice President of Marketing for Hannaford's. We have the head of Google, head of analytics for Microsoft, Cisco. We have the head of the Vice President and Strategy for Exeter Hospital. We have an amazing dude from a PR agency in Baltimore who is the best data guy for communications I have ever met. He just totally blew me away. He was in Measurement Maven a couple months ago. And he's got even more great metrics for you. So if you love measurement and want to continue the conversation, sign up for the Measurement Summit. And we'll see you all next month, I hope. Take care.